I'm mind blown. You ready for this? I have a feeling this podcast episode is going to be the most talked about in the autism recovery, autism turnaround community in 2023 and 2024. Here's why. Well, how about this? Nonverbal autism, the 4 key components to make sure that you provide everything for the mitochondria, for the electrical circuits of the brain, for the brain development and brain maturation. There are certain supplements, there are certain interventions, there are certain approaches that most people don't talk about and know about that you need to cover in order to provide the best environment for learning and speech development. There's a certain supplement that you can use. There's something you need to know about the fatty acid balance, but there's more. Addressing parasites and thinking that it's because of parasites that we need to get rid of that our children are awake during the full moon cycles. No, it's a brain that actually fluctuates with the moon. This is breakthrough, this is amazing knowledge, and there are actually things you can do, and it's linked to seizures, and there are studies proving what she's going to share about this. You mustn't miss this one. Dr. Barendse is going to share why healing the gut and the microbiome is not enough, and what you need to do instead, the missing link and gaps that nobody's talking about. And I know you love hair mineral tests, but there's only one thing that you can use hair mineral tests for. She's going to share that with you in this podcast too. Don't do hair mineral testing or gene testing to determine what diets your child needs to be on or what supplements to take. So these are just some of the things she's going to share in this amazing overview over the biomedical field and the autism recovery, autism turnaround field in 2023, looking into 2024. What do we know? What have we learned? And what can you do to help your child improve speech and minimize tantrums, stimming, echolalia, eloping, sleepless nights, picky eating, and sensory issues? Yay, let's dive in. And by the way, if this is some of the type of content that you love, a lot of you are not subscribing to the podcast or liking the podcasts or commenting or giving it some ratings. So I really would love for you to do that. If you enjoy this content, if you want more of it, help me spread the news, help me develop this podcast, and help me get higher up in the algorithm. And you can do that simply by subscribing and by giving me some stars wherever you're listening to this podcast, in iTunes or Buzzsprout or Spotify, wherever you're listening to it. And subscribing to my newsletter by going to barefootautismwarriors.com and download one of my free guides there. Okay, you ready? Let's go. Finally, I'm here with Dr. Barendse, my amazing friend and also my family's personal practitioner. She's teaching in the Autism Turnaround program as well. And we like to come on to talk about what's been happening when the year comes to an end. What did we learn? What are some of the breakthroughs? What are some of the things that we really need to remember if we want to turn symptoms around or want to get our child to the best possible outcome and more independence? And what I love about Shalene, Dr. Barendse, is that she is someone that people come to when they've tried everything else. And that's something that we probably have in common. I work in different areas. I have nowhere near her expertise when it comes to the biomedical field and the nutrigenomic field, and we're going to talk about that today. So looking back on 2023, I know you have a beautiful story to share about why this is so important for you. So welcome, Dr. Barendse, and you're the most requested guest. You're also always the most listened, the most downloaded podcast. So I'm really excited about this conversation.
Thank you so much, Ninka. Everyone listening, I hope the year has been a good one for you. It's such a pleasure to be here and to be back with you again. And thank you, Ninka, for the invitation. I was just thinking as we were preparing for today about the year that's gone by. And it's a special year, as Ninka mentioned. I was telling her a few minutes ago that the first child I ever worked with on the spectrum will graduate from university in 2024. So he's just coming up to the end of his university degree, and he's healthy, he's independent, he's charming, an absolutely amazing young man. And I've been reflecting on what makes the difference. You know, how can we actually be sure that there are millions of other young men and women like him in the years to
And
come?
he was like really literally your first client?
He was literally the first client, and you know, maybe I should unpack that a little bit more. His parents asked whether I would help. In those days, I was actually not really doing much work in this field at all. So my understanding at that time was somewhat limited, but they had heard about me and asked whether I could help. And the very first conversation we had, it was impossible really to even talk because he was around about 2.5 or 3 years old. He screeched constantly at the top of his voice. He ran up and down the hallway on tippy toes, backwards and forwards like a wild dervish. You know, there's no other way to describe it. So much so that after 10 or 15 minutes of trying to hold a conversation with his mum, I was a nervous wreck. I literally, found it very, very difficult and was unsettled for quite a long time afterwards. You know,
Wow.
how do you move forward from that? So it's a remarkable story, but it's one that I think is also replicated in many families. You know, there are so many children now that we are hearing about and we're seeing, and personally that I see, who go on to lead absolutely amazing lives.
And get to
So,
more independence. So for those who don't know you, I know that it won't be many, but there might be some new listeners that don't know. I've been working with you for years now. You are someone who helps these children, these complicated cases, also based on your own experience as a mom. Could you just sum up who you are and why you do this and how you do this, your story, and how many years of experience you have?
yeah, sure. So my background is as a health psychologist, and I spent quite a few years actually in the academic field, in research, in teaching, in consultancy, and also quite a few years in the pharmaceutical industry, consulting on patient-reported outcomes. So for me, the fascination was really at the intersection between brain and body, between, you know, what we see physically and our emotions and our moods and our experience, our lived experience. And not only in terms of what it is for us as we're living that, or for our children as they're living that, but also to help doctors understand what that might be like from a personal perspective. So, you know, the medical profession often will have a very narrow focus on bodies and on, the brain neurology or particular organs. They will have a particular focus on the way that bodies perhaps are not working properly. But then as soon as it kind of strays into something that has a psychological element, it's very easy to say, well, that's psychological. That's not down to biological or physiological things. It's just psychological. So it's mental health problems, for example, or you know, with autism. Well, it's a developmental problem that's, yes, it's to do with with the brain, but not with the underlying physiology, not with the underlying medical issues going on.
Mm.
So that was my background. And in fact, it was largely as a result of experiences with my own son who regressed that I was drawn into this field. So he's a wonderful young man. He's yes, just leading a very independent life now, and is completely neurotypical. Something that I've lived through, and when you live through that, you want to try and make sure that other young people have those same opportunities. So I tend to, as you say, I tend to see the kids who have significant problems. I want to try always to be learning and developing and moving forward in our understanding of what it is that helps to heal these children.
Yeah. And you've done that now for how many years?
Full-time in this area since around about 2014. So yeah, we're getting on for a lot of years, and more like 30 years in terms of all the other elements.
So let's catch up with where you left the story off. So these children, we want to get them to as much independence as possible. We want them to be able to communicate. The moms that I talk to on a daily basis, they are longing to hear their children say mama. They're longing to be able to understand what their children want, and whether a tantrum is out of frustration of not being able to speak or something completely different. They also see, like you will explain, a lot of physical issues. And we would like to talk about this from this perspective of how do we get a child to the best possible outcome and independence by looking at the whole child. And in the autism turnaround field, recovery field is not a word that we use, but it's out there. There's a lot of different options for moms. They go and do the diets, they do the detoxes, they do the hair mineral testing, they focus on the gut, or they focus on the brain, or they focus on the immune system, or the parasites. And we would like to, and I love, so excited for you to pull all this together so that we can talk about, okay, 2023, what's going on in all these different areas, and what is your approach to get children like this young man to as normal a life as possible. So we will go into this in different topics and areas. What would you like to start with? What's most exciting for you right now when you look back at this year that's just gone by?
So I guess, the first thing I'd say is it's really, really important. It's, we've got an exponential growth of numbers of kids on the spectrum, or who have different kind of developmental challenges. I think the latest statistics out of the US are that 1 in 6 children has a developmental disability. I mean, that's just unbelievable. So we need an exponential growth in the kids who heal and thrive. And the kids' stories are only part of this, because we've got the mums and the dads and the brothers and the sisters, and their lives are made so much more difficult because of the added workload that comes from those developmental challenges, before we even think about things like economics.
Yes.
But, what's the recipe? Well, I would say, for me, looking back, the first thing to say is we need dedicated parents. We need parents who aren't trapped in that kind of, will it work, won't it work? Is it worth my effort to do this? Oh, but it's such hard work. Yes, it is hard work. But if we do nothing, we won't see any results.
And can I just add into that one of the things that, talking to gray-haired versions of the elders in this community, like you and I, we've been through this, and we've seen many, many cases of children who lose their symptoms and even their diagnosis. In the beginning, when we started, it was a lot of trial and error with our own children. And so something that took us maybe 8 years, took me 8 years at least, to get the most significant changes, from stimming, sleepless nights, eloping, aggression, no learning, no speaking, to none of those symptoms. What you've done and what you're doing now, what we aim to do, is to compress that window so that it's a shorter time frame, because we know not only is it important to get the child to the best possible outcome, but when we get the child out of these extreme behaviors and extreme physiological issues, we then need to go back and fill the gaps. So we need, every week counts, every month counts. So if you come along and come across a solution, it's really important that you dedicate to it and understand, yes, it's hard. Yes, it takes time, but at least you won't have to spend 8 years doing this because, yeah, well, you've done all the trial and errors, right?
Yeah, and you know, I'll say this from the outset, a caveat that we do not know for sure when we start working with a child how well they will develop and grow. We cannot know. You know, we don't any more than you could with a neurotypical child. You know, we can't predict what they will become. We can't predict what they will do. So we don't know which children are going to do the best. We don't have any guarantees. All we can do is work to the best of our ability to help them actually reach their very best lives and their very best selves. So to do that, I think what I really try to focus on is to say that we want to put most effort into those few things, or the smaller number of things that move the needle the most in terms of development. It isn't about working harder all the time. Yes, it's not easy, but it's about working smarter to try and focus in on the things that are going to bring the biggest change. And so, you know, if I were going to start somewhere, I'm going to start with the easy thing to say, or the difficult thing to say. It is, you become what you eat.
Yes. So food is still on the hot list.
Look, your child's nutrition is still at the core of healing.
Yes.
But, you know, do you really know what nutrients are essential for the development, for healing, and for growth? Do you know how to get them? You know, it seems as though food myths are becoming an increasingly huge barrier to progress as our culture moves, you know, from one biased food paradigm to another. And
Talk to us a little bit about that. So food myths that might work against turning symptoms around, what might they be?
Well, look, many eating patterns might be okay to keep a healthy adult or child well in the short to medium term. But if you are subnourished and you're trying to actually work with a child who has these developmental issues, then they will not have what they need to heal or to deal with developmental challenges. Never, no way. So we've lost so much wisdom, so many strategies that are fundamental to children's health and their developmental progress. Speaking of food, for example, you know, nutrients that can't be made by the body. You know, which foods contain these essential growth factors? You know, how to get our children from their current picky eating habits, their food cravings, their food obsessions, and the patterns that they have fallen into, to the place where they're really well nourished. And I firmly believe that we're going to look back one day and realize that what we read and we hear and we see is frequently so completely inaccurate. And you know, look back in amazement at what a poor understanding we had of what's needed to develop true intergenerational health. Perhaps, you know, one of the things that's uppermost in my mind at the moment is the swing of the pendulum towards exclusively plant-based diets.
Yeah.
And, you know, on the one hand, we know that, you know, there's been this claim, well, plant foods don't contain all the essential amino acids. So protein is going to be absolutely foundational in helping our kids heal. Yes, plant foods contain protein, and in fact, they also contain all the essential amino acids, but they contain them in imbalanced ratios and at much lower levels than animal-based foods. So, for example, a typical meat or fish might be somewhere around about 25% protein, and it's a complete protein. Whereas let's take, for example, something that is labeled as being quite, high protein, and that is the pulses, the things like lentils, etc., which
And
are
peanut butter is always the example they use.
Yeah, so with pulses, we're talking around about a maximum of 10% protein.
Mm.
And what's more of a problem is that they contain lower levels of what we would describe as rate-limiting amino acids. So these are the amino acids that our bodies have to have. And particularly, we're thinking about methionine there. Methionine, for anyone who's heard me talk about methylation before, we all know that methylation is so important. That methionine is so important as the basis for good methylation, for the growth and regeneration of muscle tissue, of bodied cells, but also as the kind of starting point for our sulfur pool, which then becomes a key part of detoxification. So let's just think about, the children that we see that frequently have very poor muscular development. They've got very poor, growth. There are all sorts of different issues. It's not just about the body, it's about the brain as well, because these are the building blocks for neurotransmitters, for the way that our genes are expressed, for all of these things. So it's fascinating to me to see how many kids, when we just give them what they need in terms of these basic building blocks of food, they start to thrive. Their symptoms become much reduced, and they begin that kind of developmental progress that's been lacking.
Mm.
So that's one of the myths, and probably the number one concern for me at the moment. We also know that on the balancing side, we don't want to overdo protein beyond what's digestible. But on the flip side of that equation, that's probably much less of a concern for many of our children than just not having enough. Because if you don't have the building blocks to start off with, then you're not going to be able to make these essential ingredients for development.
Okay. What you said, you talked a little bit about the recipe for addressing this to make sure that everything is covered. And so if we take our big pot, now we're going to add in the ingredients that's needed. You mentioned family needs to be involved in this, and we need resilience in the families and dedication. What else, when it comes to tools, foods, approaches, will work, and what ingredients do we want to leave on that shelf and leave behind? Often some of those tools and shelves and ingredients on the shelf is actually very popular in the community.
Yeah, interesting. I think the first thing to say is that you're right. There are many different kind of elements that we want to pick and choose, and none of them will be appropriate for every child. So how do we actually work out what each child needs? And for me, that comes down to a couple of things. Look, we need to be very good at observing, as parents, we need to be able to observe them. We need the observation that comes from testing as well, frequently. Certainly there has to be some kind of a balance in that, because we might see, for example, families who come in with 20 tests, 25 tests, and they've dug deep down different rabbit holes, but still have missed some of the critical things in terms of development that we know are really important. And for me, maybe we can unpack that a little bit more, but I'm looking, for example, at brain biochemistry. That's super important, the chemistry in the body and in the brain. I'm looking at the way that immune balance pans out for our children, because frequently we've got this kind of underactive innate immune response where we're just not, they're not able to defend themselves adequately against all of the different pathogens and allergens, etc., that are in their environment. And on the other hand, they're going to overreact to things that they should be able to tolerate. That in a healthy body, you have a balance between tolerance and defense. So immunity definitely is one of those things that we need tools to look at. And the third thing for me is the excitatory or the electrical balance in the brain, particularly. And it's something that goes a long way back. It's something that you see, things like the Reed diet. Amy Yasko was one of the huge thought leaders in this area, but there are many other giants in the field who have paid close attention to the excitatory effects of the different challenges that our kids face. And for me, it's a huge thing, because we can see so many children who are facing huge mood swings, difficulty with communication, difficulty with all sorts of problems with concentration, with sleep. And when we pay a little bit of attention to this balance between the excitatory and the calming activity in the brain, we see huge changes and benefits to the kids in terms of their development and their daily rhythms. So I guess for me, we're talking about observing, and that means both being a parent who's able to watch and to see what's going on. It's being a parent who's able to know and select some key tests to work out what's happening for your child. And then we get into the next bit along, which is really understanding what those things are saying to us about putting together a solution.
So if we take some examples, there are some different things that we want to talk about: nonverbal autism and parasites and seizures and different things that we see a lot in the community. If we start with the nonverbal lack of speech development or scripting or echolalia, there will be different ways of moms experiencing, hey, my child is not saying mama, my child cannot communicate, my child seems frustrated or socially awkward. And there are several biochemical reasons for that I would like to cover. But if we start with these main topics that you were covering, the brain maturation and fatty acid balance, mitochondrial imbalances, brain development, after removing the things from the diet that can cause problems with the brain and speech development. Let's dive a little bit into nonverbal autism. I want to just give us time to talk about it. What is it? What can cause it? What can be done about this that we don't hear much about? So let's start with the fatty acid balance. And that's a strange link.
Yeah, I think we get into this little bit of a, how would I describe it, as a tangle when it comes to nonverbal autism. It's like a ball of wool that's all tangled up, and what is it that's part of this particular child's picture? It will be different for every child. So we know, for example, that the structural brain development of some children before birth is altered in ways that probably make it quite difficult for them to experience the same sort of verbal development that other children might do. So are we looking, for example, at a complete recovery or the potential for complete recovery, or are we looking at elements in which some children will not ever develop full verbal communication skills? And I think we have to meet that one head on and say, yes, there are some children that we know that the structures involved in verbal communication for those children have not developed adequately. Does that mean that they're not going to be able to communicate? Well, definitely not, because there are other ways that we can help them and assist them to be able to have a very rich way of communicating. And I guess, we could think about, some of the people that we know in the expert field who actually are not able to communicate verbally, but are able to use assisted computer technology to communicate really well. So
Yes.
leave that group aside.
So with children who are born with difficulties and born never ever developing speech, I assume that it's still important to turn every stone when it comes to all these different elements: mitochondria, brain, maturation, diet and food, and brain development, removing opioids, restoring the excitation in the brain, and the fatty acid balance, just to make sure that you...
Yeah, here's the thing, we won't know until we've tried everything what is possible. And that's a difficult thing for us to kind of hold. It's something that that uncertainty is difficult to hold. But I do believe we have to hold that uncertainty and to acknowledge it and to say, well, okay, I don't have those guarantees, but I'm still going to leave no stone unturned. Yeah. Because we can't get away from this fact that there is no direct one-to-one correlation between underlying causes and symptoms. So each of the things that might be contributing to the problems with verbal communications might have to be addressed before we know which one is going to make that breakthrough. But also, we know that communication and that verbal communication is one of the last things, or one of the more advanced areas of brain development. So, I have very esteemed colleagues who have seen huge advances in young people's speech very, very late on in their teenage years. Dr. Walsh, who's a great mentor of mine, he describes, young people that he's worked with in years gone by who developed speech and language abilities in their late teens or even in adulthood. Now, I don't have that experience, but, it's just to say it's possible. And so we mustn't give up when we know that there are issues that we're facing now.
Okay. So let's dive into some of the stones that need to be turned in order to address speech and speech development. Let's start with
one of the things that we know for certain that the balance of, for example, of copper and zinc in the body is really critical. Now, you'll hear me come back to this time and time again because it affects so much of not just mood and behavior, but also of brain development. Mm-hmm. And anyone who's listened to me before will have heard this over and over again, probably, that metallothionein is one of the molecules in the body that is absolutely critical for brain maturation. So we've got to think about, a baby who's 6 months old, their brains are very immature. They will have some limited speech. As they get older, yes, they will be exposed to a wide range of stimuli and experiences, and they'll be listening in the background to all sorts of language even before they're born. But their ability to actually produce language and to produce it appropriately will grow and develop as they grow and develop. And so what are the things involved in that? Well, or what are turning it around the other way? What makes that more difficult? Well, a lack of metallothionein is going to do that. And here's the interesting thing. Metallothionein, it's just a chemical like any other in the body, but it plays this important role in maturation of the brain and also in defending blood-brain barrier, etc. It takes lots of zinc to make one molecule of metallothionein. So if we're low in zinc, which many, many, many of our kids are, it's going to affect brain maturation. It's going to affect speech and language. It's going to affect mood and behavior. And it's going to affect immunity. So it's actually one of those huge issues. It's also going to have a kind of a seesaw association with copper. So high levels of copper in the body, low levels of zinc, frequently. And that's kind of contributed to by the fact that many mums these days, we perhaps have been on contraceptive pills, which tend to increase estrogen dominance, copper levels rise. Many mums perhaps have had infertility treatment. There are all sorts of reasons why copper levels might be high in the body, zinc levels low in the body, and actually that starts the ball rolling for our children. If that's imbalanced in mum, then it's going to be very difficult for them to have balanced levels after birth.
Of metallothionein.
Balanced levels of zinc. And
Okay.
because zinc is that kind of used up, we use up a lot of zinc in metallothionein. We've got to have a big pool of zinc available for that. We also know that if your immunity is low, if you're constantly fighting off infections, etc., then it's going to be using up a lot of zinc. We know that sugar creates a demand for zinc as well. So lots of reasons why zinc might be low in our kids, and that's one of the first places to look when we're saying, look, we need to make sure these underlying biochemical things are balanced so that we've got the best chance possible of that brain maturation, which is going to then feed into speech and language development.
So taking a step back, looking at it from the outside, what are some of the contributional factors or contributing factors to low metallothionein in mom's pregnancy and early years for children? Diet, anything that can give moms an aha moment about what might have caused this, but that's less important than what might fix it or improve it.
Yes, so I mean, the zinc issue is probably one of the biggest ones, or if it's the biggest one, by my way of understanding, because we know that zinc is lower in the soils these days, that foods are lower in zinc. We know that the demand for zinc is really huge because of our exposure to all sorts of different things. We know that levels tend to be low. We also know that there's this absolutely exquisite relationship between zinc and copper before and after birth. So mum needs lots of copper in the pregnant stage to support a healthy pregnancy and to have good blood vessel development for the baby and the support of the placenta. And that should actually switch kind of very quickly after birth in that first kind of day or so after birth to favor more zinc and drop down the copper levels. But also the mum's body should adapt to then give baby lots of zinc and preferentially give them zinc because that's what they're going to need to develop. Yeah. And unfortunately, if mum's levels are low before the birth, then mum actually will not have the zinc available in the breast milk to preferentially feed the baby all the extra zinc it demands. Wow. So breastfeeding, a lack of breastfeeding, may make things more difficult. Where mum's deficient, then that's going to have a knock-on effect. It doesn't just mean that if I breastfeed, I'll be fine, my baby will be fine. We need to also think about what's available left for the baby, and if mum's low in zinc, then that's going to be a problem.
Any diets that are popular that will contribute to low metallothionein levels and low zinc levels and contributing?
Well, the typical kind of pasta, pizza, bread diets that also I guess the low levels of high levels of plant foods in the diet and lower levels of meat, etc. All of those will contribute. So it's one of the frustrating things for me because we will have many families will go to their doctor and the doctor will run blood tests, run basic blood tests. They'll come back and they'll say everything's absolutely fine. But they haven't measured some of these really crucial elements. And once we do measure them, we see that they might be, perhaps we're looking for a ratio between copper and zinc of, 1:1, perhaps. Whereas in actual fact, we find that those copper zinc ratios are much, much higher, maybe 2:1. I've even seen 3-to-1 in little children. And there's no way their development is going to proceed well when there are those sorts of imbalances in their bodies.
Well, touching upon those tests, actually, while you're mentioning this, you talk a little bit about hair mineral testing, because that's another thing that's very popular in the autism mom community, is to do hair mineral testing to determine what foods to eat and whether or not you need more copper or zinc. So there's a trend for assuming that it's actually low copper. That's the issue, as you know, with some of the protocols out there. What is hair mineral testing good for, and what's it not a valuable measurement for when we're talking about
it's a good question. The internet is a bit of an echo chamber, and the community is an echo chamber. We will often find that there's perhaps one particular person who has developed hypotheses around particular tests or particular markers, and that they've developed a way of perhaps interpreting tests, and everyone has in their search for understanding has then jumped on the bandwagon and assumed that what you see is what you get in terms of these tests. But it's much more nuanced than that. So, for example, with a hair mineral test, there has been a lot of hypotheses around how many metals, essential metals, fall into the yellow zone or the red zone, or the danger zone, doing counting and say if you've got this particular number that's in the yellow zone or that's above that red zone, then that's a problem. For me, I find it very interesting and also very confronting that there is not a good relationship between most of the markers on the essential elements in a hair mineral test and what we see when we look at bloods. Either blood plasma, blood serum, or intracellular levels. So for me, think about hair. It's an excretory organ. It is actually excreting whatever is available into the hair follicle, and that's what we see in the record. So those essential metals, all we're seeing is what's being excreted. It doesn't give us a good understanding of body balance. Whereas I would say that the levels of toxic metals, we can be certain of one thing, and that is if we see toxic metals being excreted in the hair, if they're present in the hair sample, leaving aside the possibility of contamination perhaps, but we know that we prepare the hair samples well, and we make sure that we just wash in a mild shampoo, for example, or before taking the sample. If we see that there's heavy metals present in the sample, we know that that's been excreted from the body. We know that it's been in the body. What we can't know is how much else is stored there.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an interesting thing in itself, because again, there's no absolute. We might find that as children's metabolisms improve, they become better able to mobilize the heavy metals from where they're stored in tissues. Then we might see more being released and more being excreted in the hair.
Yeah, so you actually said that sometimes what looks like something's worse, like a high level, is actually a sign that things are getting better, because high levels means that the child might be excreting more.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. And equally, if we see nothing, that can sometimes be an indication that this child is just not able to mobilize these heavy metals. And that's a problem in itself. So, if we see that there are significant symptom burden for a child, and yet all of those heavy metal markers are low, that's a bit of a red flag frequently as well.
Yes. Okay. Other tests that you think people could save money by not doing that's not really useful that you might mention while we are at it?
Yes. Look, I really find, I do like a hair mineral test to look at heavy metals.
Yeah.
I am a huge proponent for checking zinc and copper balance. The number one, probably to start with for any parent is just to check vitamin D levels, because we know that on almost every possible marker, when it comes to health and wellness, to mental health, to everything, if vitamin D levels are low, then you will have problems. So many of our kids are low in vitamin D. Start there. You can run a vitamin D finger prick test at home. And while it's not pleasant, you can do that for, maybe 30 pounds, $30, $40, 40 euros, and come back with a verified, accurate vitamin D level.
And
If
what do you
vitamin D,
want to keep the level on for kids?
well, it's interesting because the Institute of Medicine, the IOM, set out to try and work out what was an appropriate vitamin D level years ago. And they came to the conclusion that what they're saying is inadequate, which was 30, a level of 30, that was definitely kind of, suboptimal, but they didn't, but they were waiting for more evidence before they said actually what is optimal. So I would just always say, look, let's try and aim for vitamin D levels in the top third of the range, or at least the top 50% of the range. And so actually, just an important thing to say here is that different tests will have different normal ranges. So rather than giving an exact, level, look for something at least 50% of the normal range or above.
Yeah.
The other end of the equation, we don't want it to be massively high, because that can be a problem as well. But number one place to look.
Yes.
We've talked about copper and zinc balance, and with that in a trio, I would always be looking for ceruloplasmin, because when we go one level deeper, when it comes to zinc and copper, we also want to know how much free copper is in the system. It's very oxidatively stressful when there's a lot of free copper there. So in other words, it's making free radicals that are damaging in the body. And if we can tame that damage, then that will go a long way towards helping development progress as it should.
Yes. Any other tests you would recommend and tests you would advise against? I know you talked a bit about SNPs and the DNA testing to determine food choices or lifestyle choices not being the best idea.
Yeah, so maybe first of all to say that, we know that iron balance is really important, and that many of our kids will have imbalances in their iron, particularly low, perhaps low ferritin levels. It's something that needs a little bit of care around interpreting, because ferritin it's an acute phase reactant, so it kind of is doing a juggling job between what it's carrying, I guess is the best way to describe it. But low iron levels is definitely a problem for kids. High iron levels is also a problem, and some of us genetically have some issues around storing iron, so that can be a problem. Mm-hmm. When it comes to moving on into gene tests, as you were just asking, the value in genetic tests for me is very nuanced, very kind of precise. So we've got a lot of availability of tests that are looking at just selected variants. And those can be as expensive or more expensive even than having a whole genome sequenced these days. Mm. So it comes down to what are you looking for and how are you going to interpret it? And then I guess one other thing as well, which is getting into the ethics of testing children's genetics. But I would say a lot of money is wasted on SNP tests or these tests of polymorphisms. And So, the idea that an MTHFR gene variant means that you need, folate in methylated form or something, there's a lot of myths around things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Can it give an understanding? Yes, there can definitely be, some help, particularly in saying, well, why might it be, for example, that this child has issues around vitamin D storage? But when it comes to the things that really move the needle in progress, I would not put a lot of money into gene tests, excepting in one situation, and that is if we want to deep dive and understand how best to help children who are not making progress, then a whole genome sequence test can be very, very helpful.
Yes, you would need someone to interpret that then, right?
Yes, and there it's a little bit, it's a wild west, I guess is the way to describe it. The whole gene testing field is a wild west. It's getting better all the time, but still, I guess one of the areas which I think is potentially quite exciting or quite, perhaps not exciting is not the right word, but there has been this idea that if you have 2 copies of a particular mutation in your genetics, then you will have a particular condition. If you have 1 copy, you won't have that condition. And this is, I'm talking about medical conditions here. Whereas
Yeah.
we're now coming to understand that in actual fact, 1 copy might create quite significant issues as well.
Yeah.
Even though it won't be as bad as the 2 copies, then it might be having significant impact on ability to, for example, metabolic storage diseases and things like that. So we may frequently find things in a child's genetics that help us to understand how to help them when we dig that deep.
And just for those who haven't heard before, when you get a test that shows that you've got MTHFR, there's the whole MTHFR docs and groups, and you'll be told to take a methylated B vitamin or methylated B12, so methylfolate or other forms of methylated vitamins. And can you just super short, because we talked about that a lot, talk about why that is in this group of people with autism, depression, these issues that we are dealing with, the learning difficulties and behavioral issues, why that might not be a good idea?
Yeah, look, it just basically comes down to the fact that all you're doing is you're having a look at 1 or 2 little influences at points on the genetics, and that it discounts all the other influences of all the other points on a gene. So, for example, on a MTHFR gene, there might be 50 or 60 different variants, and some of them will be speeding things up, and some of them will be slowing things down. Some of them will have no effect. But the best way of understanding things like methylation is actually to look at the way those genes are expressed. And to do that, we're looking at blood tests. We're not looking at gene tests. So frequently, we might compare 2 tests where someone's had a genetic, a SNP test, and it shows up, for example, that they have, 2 copies of an MTHFR, a gene variant, and yet we look at their methylation profile and actually they're methylating well, or vice versa. So the best thing to do is to look at how those genes are expressed.
Okay. Moving back to the nonverbal, we covered the zinc to copper ratio. Would you talk a little bit about restoring the balance in the excitation, and also a little bit about fatty acid balance when it comes to turning every stone to develop speech?
Yeah, look, perhaps one of my biggest hobby horses, the things that I am most exercised about, is excitatory balance. So, we have neurons that fire, that we are electrochemical beings.
Yeah.
Neurotransmitters, for example, they are dependent on an electrical impulse to push them across the synapse between the gap between two nerves. And that balance should enable to be balanced, the nerve should return to a resting state after it's fired. What happens with a lot of the foods that we're encountering these days is that they have additives in them that make them very excitatory, so that the firing threshold actually is very low. It just means that it's a bit like having your nerves on edge would be the best way to describe it. You know, you imagine that you're constantly in fight or flight mode. Well, it's a little bit like that, I guess, with nerves, that they never get a chance to go back to rest and relaxation. So if neurons don't rest and relax, then they become damaged. And then there's a scavenging process goes on, whereby that they will be destroyed. They will, we will actually lose neurons, and that will have a knock-on effect to nearby neurons. So the resting potential of our brains, of our nervous system is really critically important, and it has so many effects on mood and behavior and all these other things, on learning, on ability to concentrate, on ability to sleep, etc. So number one thing, perhaps out of any of these kind of slightly more subtle things for me, is just to make sure that we get rid of those neuroexcitotoxins out of a kid's diet. And when we do that, actually, it's quite remarkable how easily we can see progress. I'll just give you a quick little snippet. A mum who said to me this year, we had a little bit of a look at her child's diet because her child was not sleeping. And I said, well, tell me what's going on there. What's she having in the evening meal, etc. And it turned out that the evening meal was containing quite a lot of chicken with skin on that had been cooked on the bone. And we know when we're looking at levels of excitotoxins, of these neuroexcitatory compounds, that's going to be quite high. So she went away as suggested, and actually changed up the diet for the evening and took those out. And she called me 3 days later and said it's just like a miracle. She slept through after that she slept. Now, it's not always as dramatic as that, but I think it's super, super important. We know that, for example, that GABA is the other side of the equation. GABA is the calming neurotransmitter, or the primary calming neurotransmitter. And if we can get that GABA glutamate balance right, it just has such profound impacts on kids. So, top tip, look out for those neuroexcitotoxins. They're everywhere. They're in the things like aspartame, the tendency now to have lots of sugar-free things, drinks and etc. Lots of flavorings. In fact, it's very, very challenging to try and find processed foods and ingredients that don't have excitotoxins in them. Frustrating.
And you also mentioned the broths and the healthy foods, the things that are healthy for the gut.
Yeah, lots of families will come in, from a GAPS or from an SCD diet, and GAPS, bone broths are up there in terms of the recommendations for those sorts of diets. But we've got to face the issue that they're high in glutamate, so these excitatory compounds. They're high in histamine, and that those things are going to make life pretty difficult for lots of kids. So while they might have a place in the very short term for gut healing, they can create their own challenges.
And you said there's one supplement that might help, that has helped some children, the L-carnosine.
Oh, okay. Yes. Look, there's, we're always looking for that holy grail when it comes to speech and language. We know that speech and language is impacted by mitochondrial problems. And so anything that improves mitochondrial function may help. We know that the balance of fatty acids is really valuable. We know that copper zinc is really important. One of the kind of magic bullets that was looked at is something called L-carnosine. And it's a dipeptide, so it's actually just, effectively compound of amino acids. And in relatively small tests, small trials, it did help with speech and language. So definitely something that could be trialed for your child. And then we get into some of the more kind of complex things like secretin, etc., which seems to improve speech and language for a very short period of time. And after that, it's gone again. And then we just get into kind of all of those more fundamental, foundational things that we can do with a child around fatty acids, around, all sorts of other mitochondrial help, etc.
What I love is your approach to fatty acids, because out there is a tendency to say, hey, just give your child omega-3s or fish oil or whatever, cod liver oil. Your approach is different fats for different children, but not only that, different fats for the different children at different times in their development and their healing journey, right? So different fats for certain symptoms, and then it's not that fatty acid for the rest of the recovery process.
No, and it's a challenge because it is about, we do know that the omega-3 to omega-6 ratio is so important, and that the typical kind of vegetable oils and fats that tend to be in the diet from things like, even seeds, etc., has a preponderance of, it skews the ratio so that it's omega-6 heavy and omega-3 light. So the idea is that if we give lots of omega-3, that will solve the problem. Whereas in actual fact, for me, it would be more about leave out the unhealthy omega-6 fats, just take them out altogether. Then you don't have to try to artificially raise the omega-3s. Then balance, then kind of you're dealing with a much more balanced ratio to start off with. Once you're starting from that perspective, then yes, we can look in more detail at how we can help with different fatty acids that are going to be foundational, but different children definitely have different needs. So for example, children who tend to have a lot of pyrrole issues, if they're excreting pyrroles and they have this deficiency of vitamin B6 and zinc, then they are not going to do particularly well on fish oil until the pyrroles get under control. So, you're right, there is no one size fits all diet. And unfortunately, because, if our kids came with instruction manuals, wouldn't that be amazing? This particular model needs this particular thing. Unfortunately, it's not like that.
Thank you for that. That's so important. What about removing foods? What foods, when it comes to developing speech? We already talked a little bit about sugar and the processed foods, the excitatory foods, but what about the opioids? Could you just touch on that? What are they, and how do we get rid of them? And why is it that so many people say, well, I tried the gluten dairy-free diet, it didn't do much for us?
Couple of things to say. I mean, I've just been processing what you were asking over a couple of questions. And the first thing I would just say is, look, I don't like to focus on one particular manifestation of a developmental delay. So, for example, talking about speech and language, yes, it's high up in our wish list for our kids. But keep in mind that it's just one of the signs of progress and of neurodevelopment. And in the same way that we get a new baby, they can't speak. I've got a little grand niece, and I saw photos of her, a little video of her yesterday, trying to talk to her mum, and she's only about 2 months old, and she's having that language in her own baby talk. It is a process of development for speech and language, and so it's the same for our kids. Many of them have very, very rich understanding of speech and language, but just not be able to produce it until that brain maturation process is much more complete. So then let's just think about it as part of that overall picture of maturation. Now I've forgotten what the question was. Just repeat the question again.
The opioids. So
opioids. Yeah, thank you. Opioids. Yeah. So here's the thing with opioid peptides. They act like they act in a similar way to opioid drugs. And so you could think of it as being just impacting kind of almost any brain function that you might wish to speak about. And that one of the things we know they do is it makes it much more difficult to hear the beginnings and endings of words. So when we're kind of thinking about the way that speech and language is understood, so when we're listening, it's very important to understand the distinction between the end of one word and the beginning of the next. So we know that under the influence of opioid peptides, that becomes more difficult, which then means that the ability to understand and to comprehend language is going to be more difficult. But also with gluten and dairy, there are two questions I would always ask. First of all, I'd say we've got this very narrow understanding of why might it be important to eliminate gluten, for example, from the diet. And that's tended to revolve around celiac disease and say, well, if I don't have celiac disease, then I don't need to eliminate gluten. But there's far more to it than that. We know that gluten has an effect on the brain. We know that gluten has an effect on methylation because it uses up a lot of a DPP4 enzyme. We know that there are other issues as well. So we also know that the residues or the impact on the immune system of gluten and dairy stays. It's very long term. You know, it might be up to 3 months, 4 months, even longer. I've seen statistics around as many as 9 months of strict elimination needed before the body's immune response returns to, as it were, a resting state. So first of all, you know, have you given it a good long time to be able to a proper trial? Second thing is there contamination in the diet that actually it's not particularly strict and that you're being fairly careful, but then, you know, at the birthday party, the child's having some cake, or, you know, when they're out, they might be having that sip of milk, or those small infringements will still have an effect on immune response.
That's so important, because you can't do it a little bit, you got to do it 100%. And then there was one thing you mentioned before we pressed record, and that was something about the visual impairment that could happen during pregnancy. What was that? About developing speech? That's
it wasn't visual impairment, actually. It was hearing.
Sorry.
It was hearing. So we know that, for example, there are some infections before birth, and I guess the perfect example there would be with rubella, that exposure to rubella virus before birth may affect hearing. Cytomegalovirus is another one that has a significant impact. And of course, if a child's hearing development doesn't proceed normally before birth, then that's going to make things much more difficult later. So, you know, it's one of those things that I just keep in the back of my mind. If there's, you know, has there been exposure to some of these things during pregnancy? And we do, you know, find a fairly significant number of mums who report having had some of these viruses during the pregnancy, or suspected viruses, in which case I think it just reinforces that idea that we don't have all the answers. We may have to accept that there are some children for whom it will be more difficult to develop full speech and language, because they're starting from that more affected developmentally baseline.
One of the things that's so interesting is that what we have seen in our own case, we started physical training, we started that immediately when he was around 5, and developing the parts of the brain that's linked to inner ear and cerebellum by creeping, crawling. It was like a take on the Doman method, but not the Doman method because it doesn't create lasting change. And we've continued that throughout his journey. And that inner ear, the stimulation, the physical stimulation of balance and cross coordination and visual stimulation actually teaches the brain to take in information visually, and auditory processing is so important too for the brain development. That's why when kids have what's it called, grommets, like the tubes, or if they have a lot of ear infections, that can be part of the lack of development of speech and learning difficulties as well. So I just wanted to mention that. Let's take a little break just to get some water, and then we'll be right back. So we just had a refill of water, and we're back to talk about hot topic, parasites. It's something that moms talk about a lot, think they are treating or addressing. And you're going to talk a little bit about why we might have gotten this whole thing about parasites wrong. It's particularly when we have symptoms that occur during full moon, and we think it's because of the activity of the parasites. Let's dive into why that might not be the case, and something even more interesting might cause an exacerbation of symptoms during full moon.
Yeah, really interesting. And one of those things that I guess I've gone back to time and time again, because when you're working with a lot of families and you see a focus being put on one particular issue and you don't see an appropriate response afterwards, and families trying again and again and again rounds of parasite treatment and not getting a lot of progress, then for me that's always a big question mark. Well, have we got it wrong? Is this something that within the community somehow we have spun this out of all proportions? And the first thing I would just say is, look, absolutely, I have no doubt that there are some children who are bothered with parasites. We know that threadworms, for example, little pinworms, are a huge issue for sleep for many of our kids. We know that there are parasites that can really impact the roundworms and the hookworms and the tapeworms. They'll impact nutrient levels in the body, etc. So it's not to say that they aren't a problem sometimes. But this whole question about the full moon, I've been fascinated because doing a little bit more of a deep dive into that, most of what or everything really that you see about parasites in the full moon is suggesting that the mood changes that many parents will report around about the full moon with their children is down to parasites. And in actual fact, what is really interesting is that there is some very good evidence that human brain structure fluctuates with the full moon. So what are we talking about here? Well, there's a study of 15 volunteers that looked at magnetic resonance imaging, MRI images of their brains in each of the lunar cycles, and actually discovered that different volumes of the structures were changing. So the hippocampus, for example, we know that the hippocampus is involved in memory, etc. So that these were shown to be significantly different around the time of the full moon, and that the suggestion there is that the lunar phases affect the brain structure. Well, we know that brain structure affects brain function. Then we come on to some other studies. For example, there's one that looked at, reviewed the neurological records for people who were admitted to emergency units because of seizures, nearly 1,000 people in this study. And they divided them up according to when the 4 different phases of the moon occurred in respect to when they were being admitted to hospital, and found that there was a significant increase in seizure frequency around the time of the full moon. And then we've got one more just to talk about, which actually looked at a slightly different element and found that people spent around about 30% less time in deep sleep, in non-REM sleep, at the time of the full moon, and that those changes were also associated with decreased levels of melatonin. Now, we know that melatonin is that really powerful natural sleep hormone. And just, from a clinical perspective, probably the most beneficial thing that I have noted is that melatonin supplementally reduces seizures. So it kind of all fits really neatly. I love to see where there's a marrying up of a hypothesis and an observation and a kind of an understanding of what might be going on there. So in this case, I think, for me, I don't think the jury's out on parasites and full moon. I think we just have to accept that there are many things that we don't understand about the way the human body has these chronological impacts that we really don't fully understand at the moment. So what does that mean in practical terms? Well, don't keep digging down the parasite rabbit hole if you notice changes in your child around about the full moon, because that can be quite destructive if we start to get into the sorts of anti-parasite regimes over and over and over again that probably also impact gut health.
That's actually this is just so brilliant. I love it. I was so excited when you shared this. That brings us to gut health and gut healing, which is another huge hot topic, and has been in 23 as well as other years. So what's important to know about feeding the microbiome and whatever we do? Is that the holy grail, or is there more to that as well?
I think where we're at in our journey of understanding, we're always trying to understand more and understand better. The first thing I'd say is that we're discovering more and more how stable the microbiome is in relative terms. That when you try to introduce big changes in the microbiome, it's probably going to slip back again afterwards. So where that brings me to is this question mark, or this, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? My observation is very much that actually a healthy body should be able to regulate the microbiome. So what is uppermost in my mind is saying, if we can improve immunity, we will improve the ability of the body to have a healthy microbiome. Of course, we want to deal with it from both ends. We want to make sure that we're trying to maximize the microbiome, the health of the microbiome, by making sure that the protective species are there in good numbers. And, this is one of the big things that I see time after time after time, that our kids are lacking those keystone protective species. But just adding them in supplementally probably isn't going to help us get there. Pulsing perhaps the foods that are going to benefit those certain species is definitely going to be helpful. Helping to modulate our immune system so that we are much better and more resilient at taming these organisms is also going to help to get us a long way along that journey as well.
Yeah.
I guess the one kind of hint and tip I would say here is just try to get away from having the same food day in, day out on your child's plate. And if we can pulse different foods, and if we can mix it up, and if we can add in small quantities, our microdosing approach that we've talked about before, it works. It works for lots of families really well. It's not the whole story, but it is going to certainly lay a great foundation.
And though these are all, so when you're listening to this, you might get an understanding of the fact that it's not a one cause, one solution thing for any child. It'll be different from child to child. And this is why we really like to cover all these things when we work with moms. So not just feeding the microbiome, but really regulating immunity. Not just do that, but also understand what supports methylation so that it's at balance and not flipping over or under. Activating neurotransmitters, hormones, enzymes. So also looking at the brain, but not just the brain, but the way that the brain sits in the whole system and what can affect brain chemistry and brain balance. And then using food and herbs rather than this killing and binding and treating parasites, molds, candida, the things that will kill some organisms that we don't want, but also some of the beneficial ones. And these are the approaches to understand your child's unique triggers and what happens when your child has a plateau or regresses or doesn't develop the way that you want it to. What is it in your child's unique case that causes this? This is the approach for the new, this is a new way of approaching symptoms and getting the child to the best outcome, which I really think I'm so happy to work with you on bringing to moms, because it's not easy, but in my opinion, it's the only way.
Mm. And, you know, just to come back on that, I think there are some exciting things, you know, there are some exciting things happening.
Yeah.
There are, you know, I always, I would be hoping that there are some magic bullets, some holy grails, you know, that will speed development in ways that we haven't found possible before. Are they going to work independently of these foundational elements and the, you know, the amazing diets and helping our kids to have all of those foundational elements in place? No, I don't believe so. But there are some fascinating things coming on the horizon, and yeah, I'd love to talk a little bit more about that in the future. But in the meantime, I guess the message that I would just want to leave everyone with is so much is possible just with these foundational elements. And when we get those right, then all we're really doing is providing the building blocks that are necessary for natural, healthy child development, which should be proceeding as easily as breathing. For our kids that have had these developmental regressions or challenges, it's not going to be that easy. We have to work a little bit harder to provide what they need, but it's still the same tools that are going to get them there.
Yes, I love that. Before we just round this up and say goodbye and just close this year and look into the future, you have some exciting things coming up when it comes to hyperactivity and ADHD, and we're also going to share some more about plateaus and regression and what you can do specifically for your child when your child, to understand your child's triggers. But what's new and exciting, without sharing too much, when it comes to this epidemic of hyperactivity or hyperfocus or ADHD paralysis? When we have this whole epidemic of also adults understanding that and many of the parents with autistic children have some of these issues. Could you talk a little bit about what's on the horizon?
Yeah, I guess there are definitely some elements around kind of brain healing that, you know, special molecules and things that potentially have a huge amount of value. I would also just come back and say, we are in a unique situation these days where our children have been exposed to a lot more in terms of screens, Wi-Fi's, etc. And we know that that plays a part. We know that that is going to have an impact on our kids. One of the things that also bothers me a lot is that the developmental richness of the environment in which many of our kids grow up is limited in comparison to either years gone by or children who are in a neurotypical environment. So what does that look like? Well, if you've got a child who doesn't behave, neurotypically, and you feel uncomfortable taking them out in social situations, and you're tired and you're exhausted, and you're at home alone with them a lot of the time, then they're not going to be exposed to that rich neurodevelopmental environment that many neurotypical children will be. So I'd always just be encouraging parents to say, look, get them off the screens. Yes, I know it makes life easier to, because they're craving that. But in those cravings, they are going to be seeing the world in a two-dimensional space. They're not going to be seeing three-dimensionally. That is going to impact the development of their brains. And I would not discount for 1 minute the impact that has. We know, there are studies coming out that show that for every hour spent on the screen per day, children's IQ levels or their developmental is dropping. So, we're not talking about one particular thing. We're talking about all the different elements and different ways in which we can enrich a child's life. And I would just encourage, mums and dads to get back to the old-fashioned ways of play, of social activity, of new experiences, because new experiences are going to make new connections. So what can you do today to actually break those habits and introduce more flexibility and more new experience into your child's life?
That's so amazing. Thank you so much. I wanted you to just end this conversation by telling moms and dads listening to this. So what are the hopes? What are some of the things that might be possible when you address these things? And you have a child who's dealing with tantrums and nonverbal autism, stimming, screaming, sleepless nights, sensory issues, behavioral issues, and lack of social skills. What are the hopes that you can bring, and what will happen if you do nothing and just accept that this is the way that life's going to be, as an overview snapshot?
Yeah. So I guess the thing is, if we don't make changes and if we don't try, we will almost certainly see very little progress. But the flip side to that is that children can and do heal, they grow, they thrive. And my take-home message would be that the potential for many of our children is perhaps even greater than for neurotypical children. And the reason I say that is because some of the features of their neurodevelopment means that their abilities in selected areas will go far beyond that of a neurotypical child in their special interest fields. This is what I noticed, first of all, that many of them will have exceptional skills in certain areas as they grow older. Not only that, but not only will they have exceptional skills, but they will frequently go on to develop visibly a lot longer than a neurotypically developing teen or young adult. So we see that change and progress is possible well into the adult years. So don't feel as though what you see now is what you're going to get. Your child is a work in progress. Take every little opportunity you can to try and make sure that you are expanding your child's horizons, that you are giving them the opportunity to really excel in any areas that they seem to find interesting. And, for example, that might include computer skills. I'm a great advocate for getting a young child who's nonverbal to the point where they can communicate using a computer keyboard, etc. But always understand that they cannot show you what they're capable of. They're probably capable of far more than you would imagine, but they cannot show you that yet. So what we have to do is hold that space for them as they're growing, as they're developing, so that they have as many doors open to them later on for whatever they reach in the future. And that for me is the challenge and the privilege of parenting and caring for our neurodiverse kids.
This is just me interrupting really quickly to tell you a secret about Dr. Barendse and me and how I met her. She gave me the final clues to solve some anxiety issues, some aggression issues and depression issues that I had not been able to solve on my own. And I found out that there are only 2 or 3 practitioners in the world who really understands these underlying causes of autism and aggression, anxiety, that I had never heard about and that nobody seemed to be able to regulate. Yeah, they can test it. They know about it maybe, but they don't know how to balance it. And it's so sad, but in this huge community of functional medicine practitioners and biomedical practitioners, I haven't found anybody like her. So I forced her to sit down and tell me how I can bring this knowledge to other moms. So if you're feeling like you cannot understand why things aren't working for you and you want to work with me and Dr. Barendse in getting the same type of implementation and success path that we've used to turn symptoms around for our own children and many, many other children as well. No guarantees, of course. We're not medical practitioners, and we're not here to treat or diagnose or anything, but go to my website barefootautismwarriors.com/podcasts with an S/160 for this episode, and you'll find links to get started on working with me and Dr. Barendse, whether you are ready to take the whole step and integrate fully everything that we've done and are doing on a daily basis with other moms, or you just want to start slow. barefootautismwarriors.com/podcasts/160, and you'll find the links to get started there. Now back to the podcast. I can definitely testify to that. Attest to that, is that what you say? With my child, he keeps on developing, and he kept on developing through his teenage years and adult years, and still new skills are observed in him, including skills that nobody else has. Yeah. So thank you so much for that. I'm excited for the next year and for all the new things that you're going to offer. So thank you so much for your time and your wisdom. And
it's a great pleasure, and let me just say thank you for the invitation again, and look, so much respect and love to the families out there. Your child needs you. Without the efforts that you're putting in, your child doesn't have the same potential. So while they might not thank you now, I would like to believe that one day in the future they will turn around and they will say, thank you that you didn't give up on me. I know that your lives are not necessarily very easy, but I hope that 2024, that you go into this with new optimism and with new determination to meet those challenges, and to also try to just enjoy life as best you can along the way. Let some of the anxieties go, let some of the struggles go, and appreciate what is possible at the moment, even if you haven't reached where you want to be.
I agree. Thank you. Beautifully said. Thank you so much.
So all the best for 2024, and I hope we'll meet again.
Absolutely. I really hope you got as much from this conversation as I did, even though I know a lot, and I've been in this field for 16 years, and I turned my son's stimming, sleepless nights, sensory issues, picky eating, eloping, nonverbal autism, echolalia, ritualistic behavior, aggression, all these things around. And I've helped so many moms do the same. She always teaches me new aspects and new angles when it comes to turning symptoms around. So we covered parasites, why it's not a full moon thing. We covered the fluctuation of the brain with the lunar cycle. We covered the best tests to do right now in 2023. We covered the only thing that you can use hair mineral tests for. We covered ADHD and why gut healing and feeding the microbiome isn't enough. And we covered the nonverbal autism and the 4 pathways that you need to look at and approaches you need to look at in order to improve speech, and so much more. If you like content like this, please subscribe and like and subscribe to this podcast and share it with somebody else. Whether you're listening on iTunes or Buzzsprout or Spotify, subscribe to the podcast. So few of you amazing listeners out there are actually doing that. So few of you are actually writing to me, even though I know you're sitting there. You're out there with the symptoms. You have the sleepless nights. You're worrying about your child's future. You haven't seen the results from the therapies that you're doing, but you're not writing me. Send me an email. Contact at barefootautismwarriors.com. Couldn't even remember my own email address there. Contact at barefootautismwarriors.com. Hey, let's talk about this, right? See you next time.